"You are not what I ordered," the Duke said, in front of every servant in his hall. The woman did not lower her eyes. She set down the case that held all she owned, drew off his ring, closed his fingers around it, and walked out into the rain. What kind of woman, with nothing, hands a duke back his ring and chooses the storm? Welcome to the Governess Hour. How many times would you let someone humiliate you before you stopped flinching? What if you could not simply leave, because leaving meant the road, and the workhouse, and a winter you might not survive? What if the man doing the humiliating held every door in the county, and one word from him could close them all against you forever? Tonight's story is about a woman who was sent north to marry a stranger because she had run out of other choices. She was educated past her station and poor past her pride, which is the particular trap this channel returns to again and again, because it was real, and because so many of you have written to tell me you have lived some version of it yourselves. Before we begin, I want to know where in the world you are sitting right now. Drop your city and your local time in the comments. I read every one of them, and I love watching this quiet little community stretch clear across the globe, from a kitchen in Manila, to a car park in Ohio, to a bedroom in Lagos at 2 in the morning. This is the story of Cora Finch, who owned one good dress and a head full of languages nobody would pay her to speak, and the Duke of Reedmere, who had learned to be cruel because someone had once been cruel to him first. It is about the coldest house in England, a small girl who had been forgotten in it, and the night the whole arrangement came apart in the rain. Let me take you back to the spring of 1854. The letter that changed everything arrived on a Tuesday, and Cora Finch read it standing up, because she had already given notice on her lodgings, and there was nowhere left to sit. She had been a governess for 8 years. She had taught the daughters of a wool merchant in Leeds, and then the children of a baronet near York, and she had been good at it, better than good, because she had a gift for making a child who had been taught to feel stupid, feel clever instead. None of that had saved her. The baronet's wife had decided, over the course of a single season, that a governess who spoke 3 languages and read Greek for pleasure was a governess who thought too well of herself. There had been no accusation Cora could answer. There had only been a slow tightening, a series of small removals, until the morning she was told her services were no longer required and that a reference, given the delicacy of certain matters, would not be forthcoming. Now, I want to stop here, only for a moment, because unless you understand what those words meant, you cannot understand anything Cora did afterward. In 1854, a governess lived and died by a single sheet of paper. A reference from her last employer was the only proof she had of her character, her competence, and her conduct, and without it, she was, for practical purposes, unemployable. No respectable family would take an educated woman into their home to raise their children on nothing but her word. A governess dismissed without a reference was not merely out of a position, she was out of the profession, and often out of the only thing standing between a genteel woman and destitution. There was no pension, no relief came to a woman of her class who could not bring herself to beg. There was only the road, and what waited at the end of it, and every woman in Cora's situation knew exactly what that was. So when I tell you that Cora Finch read that letter standing up in an empty room, I need you to feel the ground she was standing on. There was almost none of it left. The letter was from a solicitor in London, acting on behalf of a lady of rank who wished to remain, for the present, unnamed. It made a proposal so extraordinary that Cora read it 3 times before she believed the words were meant for her. A gentleman of the highest station, a widower's equal in wealth though he had never married, required a wife. He required her quickly, and he required her to be a woman of education and good family fallen on hard circumstances, a woman who would understand the value of the security offered and would not expect, in return, the ordinary sentiments of a love match. The lady arranging the matter had made inquiries. Miss Finch's name had been mentioned. If Miss Finch found the notion of a settled home, a title, and the end of her difficulties agreeable, she was to present herself at Reedmere in the county of Westmorland by the last week of April, at which time the arrangement would be concluded. Enclosed was a sum for the journey. It was more money than Cora had held in her 2 hands at one time in her entire life. She should have distrusted it, and she did. A woman does not survive 8 years of other people's households without learning that the world does not hand out miracles to women like her, that a gift of this size is only ever the bright end of a hook. But suspicion is a luxury, and Cora had run out of the money to afford it. She had £4 and some shillings, a fortnight of rent already spent, and a face in the glass each morning that was beginning to look, to her own eye, like a woman running out of time. She was 26. In the arithmetic of the age that made her nearly finished. A woman was meant to be married by 20 and past hope by 30, and the years between were a narrowing corridor with fewer and fewer doors. Cora had watched younger women pass her by. She had smiled at their weddings. She had gone back to her narrow room and lain awake doing the sums that every unmarried woman of small means eventually did, the sums of how long and how much, and after that what. So she went north. The journey took the better part of 3 days, by train as far as the line reached, and then by a hired trap over roads that grew worse and lonelier with every mile. As she went, the country changed. The soft green of the south hardened into something older and more indifferent. Long brown moors under a low sky, dry stone walls running up the fells like stitches in a great grey cloth, and above it all, a silence so large that the rattle of the trap seemed an impertinence. Cora had grown up in a market town. Never in her life had she seen so much land with so few people on it. She pulled her cloak closer and told herself it was the wind. She reached Reedmere as the light was failing on the last day of April, and even prepared as she was for grandeur, the house stopped the breath in her throat. It sat above a black tarn at the head of a valley, a great pile of dark stone with 100 windows, and not one of them lit warm, and it did not look like a home. It looked like a fortress that had grown tired of the war and settled into permanence. Rooks turned above the chimneys. As the trap came up the long drive, Cora saw the servants already gathering at the door, a line of them in dark livery, drawn up as if to receive a general rather than a governess in a made-over gown, and her mouth went dry. She had not been told his name. That was the strangeness she had turned over the whole journey. The letter had spoken of a gentleman of the highest station, and had named the house but never the man, and Cora had assumed the discretion was for the sake of the family's dignity, so that if she proved unsuitable, no name would be attached to the failure. She understood now, stepping down from the trap onto the wet gravel with every eye upon her, that she had been made small before she had said a single word. She was to be inspected, found adequate or not, by a man who had not troubled himself to give her his name. An old woman came forward through the line of servants, and Cora knew at once that this was the lady who had arranged everything, because she moved through the household the way weather moves through a valley, with the certainty of something that has always been there. She was small and very upright, dressed in grey silk of a quality Cora had only ever mended, and her eyes, when they found Cora's face, were the sharpest things in that whole cold courtyard. "You are Finch," the old woman said. It was not a question. "I am, madam." "You are taller than I was led to expect." The old woman circled her once, a slow and frank appraisal, and Cora held herself still under it, the way she had learned to hold herself still under a great many appraisals. "And you do not fidget. Good. My grandson cannot abide a woman who fidgets. I am the Dowager Duchess of Reedmere. You will address me as your grace, and you will not flinch when I tell you that this is the least comfortable house in the north of England, and its master is the least comfortable man in it. Come inside before you take a chill. We have a great deal to conclude and very little evening in which to conclude it." The 2 words arranged themselves in Cora's mind as she followed the small grey figure up the steps, grandson and duchess, and the arithmetic they made was staggering. This was no gentleman of good station. This was a duke. She had been summoned north to marry a duke, and she had spent 3 days imagining a comfortable widower with a business in the wool trade, and the gap between what she had imagined and what was true opened under her feet like the black water of the Tarn. They brought her into the great hall, and it was there that she saw him for the first time. He stood at the foot of the staircase, tall and unhurried, dressed in black without a single ornament, and his face was the coldest thing in a house built entirely of cold things. He looked at her the way a man looks at goods delivered to the wrong address, at the turned gown and the travel stains, and the plain, tired face of a woman who had come 300 miles on his grandmother's word, and he took his time about it, and every servant in that hall stood witness while he did. Then he said it, in a voice pitched to carry, "You are not what I ordered." The words landed in the silence and stayed there. A footman studied the floor, the housekeeper's mouth thinned to nothing, and Cora Finch, who had been made small in a great many rooms, and had learned every way there was to endure it, discovered in that moment that she had reached the end of her endurance, and that the end of it felt not like breaking, but like a door swinging open. She did not lower her eyes. She set her case down on the marble. She crossed the distance between them, drew the emerald ring from her finger, placed it in his hand, and closed his fingers over it with her own. "Then I shall save you the expense of a return," she said. And she turned and walked out of the house of the most powerful duke in the north of England, into the rain, alone, with nowhere on this earth to go. He did not move for a very long time. Inside, the hall was vast and colder than the courtyard, all marble and shadow, and a great staircase rising into darkness. Candles had been lit, but they were mean about it, a scattering of light in an ocean of stone. The servants had followed them in and taken up positions along the walls, and Cora understood that whatever was about to happen was to happen in front of every one of them. "He knows I have come?" she asked, low. The dowager's mouth did something that was not a smile. "He knows. Whether he will behave is another matter. My grandson has agreed to this arrangement in the way a man agrees to have a tooth drawn. He wants an heir, and he wants the estate secured, and he wants, above all, never again to stand up in front of society and choose a bride and be made a fool of. So he has let me choose for him, and he has promised to abide by my choice, and now we shall see the exact worth of a duke's promise." There was a story under those words, a whole history pressed flat and put away, and Cora had no time to read it, because at that moment a door opened at the far end of the hall, and the Master of Reedmere came into it. He was tall. That was the first thing, the sheer, unhurried length of him, and he was dressed in black with no ornament of any kind, and he came down the hall without haste and without warmth and stopped a careful distance from her, and he looked at her. "I have told a great many of these stories, and I have described a great many men crossing a great many rooms toward a great many women. I want you to understand that this was not that. There was no heat in the way the Duke of Reedmere looked at Cora Finch. There was only assessment, cold and complete, the look a man gives a horse he suspects has been misrepresented to him. His eyes went over her travelling cloak, her plain dark gown, her wind-reddened face, and the pins working loose from 3 days of hard roads, and something in his own face closed like a door. The dowager began, "Reedmere, this is Miss Cora Finch, of whom I have—" "You wrote to me that she was handsome," the Duke said. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. In that silence, a whisper would have carried to the walls. "You wrote to me that she was of good family and pleasant appearance, and would do credit to the name. She is of excellent. She is a drab little governess in a turned gown." He said it the way he might have remarked on the weather, and it landed in the hall like a stone dropped down a well, and every servant along the wall went very still. His gaze had not left Cora's face. "How old are you?" Cora's heart was striking hard against her ribs, and her hands had gone cold inside her gloves, but she had spent 8 years learning to keep her voice level in rooms where her feelings were the least welcome thing present, and she kept it level now. 6 and 20, your grace. 6 and 20. He turned the words over, as if examining them for defects. Grandmother, you have gone to a great deal of trouble and expense to bring me a woman past her best, with no fortune, no connections worth the name, and the manner of a paid companion. I asked you for very little. I asked you to spare me the humiliation of the marriage market, and you have brought the marriage market to my own hall and set it down on the floor in a wet cloak. You are being, the dowager said, in a voice like the edge of a knife, unforgivable. I am being accurate. And then he turned fully to Cora, and he said the thing that she would carry for the rest of her life, the thing that every servant in that hall would repeat below stairs before the night was out. You are not what I ordered. The hall held its breath. And here is the thing that no one in that room expected, least of all the man who had said it. Cora Finch did not weep. She did not stammer an apology or drop into the small, placating curtsy of a woman accustomed to being spoken to as though she were furniture. She stood in the center of that cold marble floor, and she let the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable for everyone but her, and then she reached up and drew the ring from her left hand. It was a beautiful thing, that ring, an old square-cut emerald that the dowager had sent ahead to seal the arrangement, and it had sat on Cora's finger through 3 days of travel as the only proof she had that any of this was real. She had looked at it in the trap and let herself imagine, just for a mile or two, a life in which she was safe. Now she pulled it free, and she walked across the hall to where the Duke of Reedmere stood, and she took his hand, which he was too surprised to withhold, and she pressed the ring into his palm and folded his long fingers over it one by one. Then I shall save you the expense of a return, your grace, she said. I would not wish to be a further disappointment. You may tell your grandmother I released you. It is the only kind thing I can do for either of us. She turned. She walked the length of that terrible hall with her chin level and her step unhurried, past the frozen line of servants, and she took up her small case from where she had set it down, and she went out through the great door into the rain, which had begun in earnest now, coming down straight and cold out of the northern dark. Behind her, the Duke of Reedmere stood with an emerald ring in his closed fist, and looked at the open door and the wet dark beyond it, and for the first time in a very long time, the master of the coldest house in England did not know what to do. I have to pause here, because when I first wrote this scene, I had to get up and walk around the room. There is a particular cruelty in humiliating someone in front of an audience, in performing your contempt so that other people are made to witness it, and there is a particular kind of courage in refusing to give that cruelty the collapse it is fishing for. Cora had nothing. She had £4 and a case and a title she had just handed back, and she walked out into a storm, rather than stand in that hall one moment longer as a thing to be appraised. Some of you know exactly why she did it. I can feel you nodding. Cora got perhaps 1/4 of a mile down the black drive before the enormity of what she had done caught up with her. The rain had soaked through her cloak. The light was almost gone. She did not know the name of the nearest village or how far it lay. She had spent nearly the last of the journey money, and the road behind her led back to a house where she was not wanted, and the road ahead led into a dark she could not see the end of. She kept walking because to stop was to admit she had nowhere to walk to, and the wind came off the fells and went through her as if she were made of paper, and somewhere out in that vast wet blackness a curlew cried, a long falling note that sounded exactly like the inside of her own chest. She did not hear the carriage until it was nearly on her. It came down the drive fast, lamps swinging, and drew up hard alongside her in a spray of gravel and mud, and the door opened before the wheels had fully stopped, and the Dowager Duchess of Reedmere leaned out of it into the rain, with her sharp old face set like flint. "Get in," she said. "Your Grace, I cannot." "You can, and you will, you foolish, magnificent girl, before you die of the cold on my land, and give the coroner something to talk about for 20 years. Get in, this instant." I did not bring you 300 miles to lose you to a rain shower a quarter mile from the door." Cora hesitated, and the old woman's voice changed, and under the command there was something Cora had not expected to hear, something almost like respect. "I am not taking you back to him," the dowager said. "I am taking you out of the wet, and I am going to give you dry clothes and hot food and a bed, and in the morning, when you can think, you and I are going to have a conversation that my grandson does not deserve to be present for. You have earned that much from me tonight, Miss Finch. God knows you have earned it. Now get in the carriage." And Cora, because she was cold, and because she was out of choices, and because there had been that unexpected note of respect in the old woman's voice, climbed into the carriage. Cora woke the next morning in a bed warmer and softer than any she had slept in for years, in a room where a fire had been lit before she stirred, and for one merciful moment she did not remember where she was. Then she saw the grey light over the fells through the window, and the whole of the previous night came back, and she lay very still and let herself feel the full weight of what she had done. She had handed a duke his ring in front of his household and walked out into a storm. There was no undoing a thing like that. Whatever happened now, she had made herself into a story that would be told in this county for a generation. A maid brought her chocolate, and a gown that was not her own, grey wool of a plain good cut that fit her almost exactly, and Cora understood that the dowager had thought about this, had planned it, had perhaps lain awake herself. When she was dressed, she was taken not to any grand drawing room but to a small, warm sitting room at the top of the house, a room clearly the dowager's own, full of books and a caged linnet, and a great many years of a life, and the old woman was waiting for her by the fire, with 2 cups already poured. "Sit," the dowager said. "You will want to be angry with me. I shall allow it, but sit first." Cora sat. "I lied to my grandson about you," the dowager said, without preamble. "I told him you were handsome, because he would not have agreed to a plain woman, and I told him you were biddable, because he would not have agreed to a spirited one, and I did both of those things, because I have watched that boy turn himself into a block of ice for 11 years, and I decided, God forgive me, that what he needed was precisely a handsome, spirited woman who would not be biddable for 1 hour together. I gambled. I used you as the stake, and last night you walked out into the rain and proved me a fool, because a woman with that much iron in her was never going to stand in a hall and be inspected. I misjudged the whole affair. I am too old to misjudge things, and I am not accustomed to it, and I find I do not like it. There. That is my apology. It is the only one you will get from anyone in this house, so mark it. Despite everything, despite the cold, hard knot of the previous night still sitting under her ribs, Cora felt something in her want to smile, and she did not let it. "Why did you send for me at all?" she asked. "There must be handsome, biddable women enough in England, without dragging a governess 300 miles. Because you are not only a governess," the old woman set down her cup. "You taught the Ainsley girls at Marfield, before York. One of them is my goddaughter. She told me 2 years ago that Miss Finch had more sense and more spine than any woman in the county, and that whoever married her would be the luckiest fool in England, and I remembered it, because I collect that sort of remark the way other women collect china. When my grandson finally agreed to let me find him a wife, yours was the first name I wrote down. I did not want him a beauty. Beauties have done him harm enough, and there is one beauty in particular I have prayed nightly would stay in the south where she belongs, now that her husband is 3 months in the ground, and her creditors are circling, and she has remembered, no doubt, that she once threw over a duke. I wanted him, you." The sharp old eyes fixed on Cora's. "And I want you still, but not, I think, as I first intended. Tell me, what do you know of the child?" "The child? There is a child in this house." The dowager's voice, which had been so certain, went briefly rough at its edges. "My great-granddaughter, Catherine, though no one has called her anything but Kitty since she could speak. She is 7 years old, and she has been in this house since she was 4, since my grandson's sister and her husband were lost, and in 3 years not one person under this roof has managed to reach her, because the master of the house cannot look at her without seeing his dead sister, and so he does not look at her at all, and the nurses come and go because it is a cold house and a cold master, and the child does not speak." "Does not speak," Cora repeated. "Not since the funeral. She hears. She understands. The doctor can find nothing wrong with her throat or her wits. She simply decided, at 4 years old, in a house that had gone silent around her, that there was no use in it, and she has not said a word in 3 years, and I am 81, Miss Finch, and I am the only creature in this house who loves her, and I am afraid every single morning that I will die before I have found someone else who will." The fire cracked. Out beyond the window a rook called and was answered. "You came here to be a duchess," the dowager said. "You have refused that, and I do not blame you, and I would not ask you to reconsider it while my grandson's insult is still wet on the floor. But I am going to ask you something else, and I am going to ask it plainly, because you are a plain-dealing woman, and you will despise me if I dress it up. Stay, not as his wife, as her governess. Take the child. See if there is anything in this house you can wake. I will pay you properly, in your own name, into your own hands, and I will write you a reference in my own duchess's hand that will open any door in England, so that whatever else happens here, you walk away from Reedmere with your livelihood secured for the rest of your life. That, at least, I can undo of the wrong I have done you. Whatever you decide about the rest." And there it was. I want you to notice what the old woman had just done, because it is the hinge on which this entire story turns. She had offered Cora the one thing that had been taken from her, the one thing that mattered more than a title, or a duke, or a settled home. She had offered her a reference, security itself, a name written down by a hand no employer in England would dare to doubt. For a woman in Cora's position, that was not a wage. That was the ground under her feet given back to her. Cora looked into the fire for a long moment. "The Duke," she said at last. "He would have me under his roof. The woman he called not what he ordered, teaching his ward. He would see me at his own table." "He would," the dowager said, "and it would do him a very great deal of good. And if he objects, I shall remind him whose money built the west wing he sulks in. Reedmere is mine until I die, Miss Finch, whatever the deeds say about my grandson. He holds the title, I hold the purse. He has never once in his life won an argument with me, and he is not going to begin with this one. Will you take the child?" "May I meet her first?" The old woman's whole sharp face changed, softened, opened, and Cora saw for one unguarded instant what lay beneath all that iron. This formidable woman, brought low by love for a silent little girl in a house full of stone. "Oh, my dear," the dowager said. Yes, of course you may." They found Kitty in the old nursery in the east wing, a great bare room with one small fire and a wall of grey windows, and the child was sitting on the floor near the hearth with a slate across her knees, drawing, and she did not look up when the door opened. She was a thin scrap of a thing with her hair scraped back too tight and a pinafore too big for her, and she had the stillness of a child who has learned that stillness is safest. And when Cora saw her, something happened in Cora's chest that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with recognition. That stillness she knew. She had worn it herself, in that empty room in York, waiting to find out what would become of her. Here it was again, 3 feet high, drawing on a slate by a mean little fire. Cora did not go to her. She had learned that too. You do not go to a wary creature. You make yourself small and unalarming, and you wait, and you let them come to you. And if they never do, you come back the next day and wait again. So Cora crossed the room slowly and sat down on the floor a careful distance from the child, arranging her borrowed grey skirts around her, and she said nothing at all. And after a while she took out the little book of French fables she carried everywhere in her pocket, the one thing besides her clothes that had come north with her, and she began to read aloud, softly, in French, not to the child but to the fire, as if she were alone. Kitty's hand had stopped moving on the slate. Cora did not look at her. She turned a page and read on, an old story about a fox and a crow and a piece of cheese, her voice low and even, filling the cold room with a language the child could not possibly understand, and it did not matter that she could not understand it, because a voice reading gently to no one is a kind of warmth, and children who have gone cold can feel warmth even when they cannot feel anything else. When Cora reached the end of the fable, she closed the book and sat quietly, and she felt, rather than saw, the child studying her. She let herself be studied. Minutes passed, and then, at the very edge of her vision, the small girl turned the slate around, slowly, and held it up. On it, in a child's careful hand, was drawn a fox. Cora looked at the fox for a long moment. Then she looked, for the first time, directly at Kitty, and she smiled, a real smile, not the professional smile she had given 100 nurseries, but the smile of one prisoner, recognizing another. "He is a very clever fox," Cora said. "In the story, he is the cleverest creature in the whole wood. Shall I tell you what he does next?" The child looked at her with enormous solemn eyes, and after a moment nodded. She did not speak. But she nodded, and she did not look away, and behind them in the doorway, the Dowager Duchess of Reedmere pressed a handkerchief hard against her mouth and made no sound at all. Cora stayed. Now, it is worth understanding what it meant, in that age, for a child like Kitty to be so wholly at the mercy of the house she lived in. When a child was orphaned, she became a ward, and her person and her fortune passed to a guardian appointed by the family or the courts, and that guardian held near total power over her money, her upbringing, her marriage in the fullness of time. A well-chosen guardian was a blessing. A careless or a cruel one was a catastrophe against which the child had no appeal. Kitty had not been treated cruelly at Reedmere. She had been treated worse, in a way that leaves no mark. She had been treated as an absence, and into that absence, in a borrowed grey gown, with a book of French fables, and the patience of a woman who knew exactly what it was to be overlooked, walked Cora Finch. In the days that followed, the bridge went up plank by patient plank. The child began to sit nearer the fire when Cora read, and then nearer to Cora, and one grey afternoon, in the middle of the fable of the fox and the crow, Kitty's lips moved. They shaped a word, slowly, the way a hand closes around something breakable, and no sound came with it at all. But Cora saw the shape the small mouth had made, and knew it for the beginning of her own name. She did not look up. She did not reach for it. You do not reach for a thing like that. She turned the page and read on, and let the child understand, by not chasing it, that the word would be safe in her whenever it chose at last to come. She did not see the Duke for 3 days. This was not accident. Reedmere was large enough that 2 people could avoid one another for a week without effort, and both of them made the effort. Cora took her meals in the nursery with Kitty, or on a tray in her own room, and she learned the geography of the house, the warm rooms and the cold ones, the back stairs and the front, and she began, patiently, hour by hour, to build a bridge to a silent child. And the Duke of Reedmere kept to his study and his lands and his long solitary rides, and if he thought about the governess his grandmother had installed under his roof against his express and repeated objection, he gave no sign of it to anyone. But he thought about her. I can tell you that now, though Cora did not know it then. He thought about the sound of an emerald ring pressed into his palm, and a low, even voice saying, "I shall save you the expense of a return." 11 years he had spent making himself into a man who could not be reached, and a drab little governess in a wet cloak had walked into his hall and reached him in 90 seconds, and he did not have the first idea what to do about it, and so he did what men like him always do. He avoided her, and he told himself it was contempt. They met, when they finally met, over the child. It was the 4th evening, and Cora had taken Kitty down through the quiet house to the long gallery, because the child liked the portraits, or at least stood before them with an attention she gave to little else, and Cora had been naming the painted Reedmeres for her, inventing small histories for the grim dead dukes and their unsmiling wives, when a voice spoke out of the shadows at the end of the gallery. "You are filling her head with nonsense. That is Duke Ambrose. He never fought a bear in his life. He died of gout at 70, in his own bed, complaining about the soup." Cora turned. The Duke of Reedmere was standing by the far window with a glass in his hand, and she had no idea how long he had been there, listening to her tell his ward that his ancestor had wrestled a bear on the Reedmere fells. Kitty had gone rigid at the sound of his voice and pressed herself against Cora's skirts, and Cora felt the small hand fist in the wool, and something protective and hard rose up in her. "Then I stand corrected, Your Grace," she said. "Though I should think a man who complained about soup for 70 years the more remarkable achievement, it takes a rare persistence." She heard him set the glass down. "You are impertinent," he said. "I am, rather. You did warn your grandmother you could not abide it. Kitty, come, it is past your hour." She took the child's hand to lead her out, and she had almost reached the door when he spoke again, and his voice had changed, and the change was so slight that only a woman who had spent her life reading the small weather of other people's moods would have caught it. "She stands closer to you," he said, "than she has ever stood to anyone." Cora stopped. She looked back at him down the length of the dim gallery, and for the first time she looked at him not as the man who had humiliated her, but simply as a man, and what she saw surprised her. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the child, at the small fist knotted in Cora's skirts, and there was something in his hard face that he had not permitted anyone to see, a hunger and a grief so old and so carefully buried that it had almost forgotten how to show itself, and it was directed at a 7-year-old girl who could not bear to be in the same room with him. "She is a clever child," Cora said, more gently than she had meant to, "and a frightened one. The two together make for a great deal of stillness. It is not that she cannot reach people, Your Grace. It is that she has decided, on good evidence, that people cannot be relied upon to stay. I should know. I made the same decision at rather a greater age, and it took me a good deal longer to unmake it." For a moment he said nothing. Then, "Good night, Miss Finch," he said, and turned back to the black window, and Cora took the child up to bed, and lay awake herself for a long time afterward, turning over the look on a cold man's face in a dark gallery, and finding that she could not entirely despise a man who looked at a child like that. She became aware of him after that. This is the beat every one of these stories must hit, and I want to be honest with you about how it arrived for Cora, because it did not arrive as a swoon, it arrived as a tension. She began, against her own will, to notice when he entered a room, to feel the change in the air of the house when he was in it, to find her eye going to the window when a rider came up from the fells. She told herself it was vigilance. A woman alone in a great house learns to track the movements of its master the way a small animal tracks a hawk. But it was not only vigilance, and she was too honest a woman to pretend to herself for long, and what she admitted to herself, at last, lying awake, was that she had begun to be curious about the loneliest man she had ever met. The accidental touch came on a wet afternoon on the servants' stairs. Cora was carrying a tray of the child's supper up the narrow back stairs, because she would not have a footman toil up 4 flights when she had 2 good hands, and the Duke was coming down them, which no Duke in England had any business doing, and they met on the half landing in the grey light from the one small window. There was not room for 2 people and a tray to pass. He reached out and took the tray from her hands to let her by, and his ungloved fingers closed over hers on the wooden edge of it, and neither of them moved. It lasted the length of a breath. His hand was warm, that was all. His hand was warm, and hers were cold from the draughty stairs, and for the space of one breath, his fingers were over hers on the edge of a supper tray on a back stair where no one could see them, and then she drew her hands away, and he stood aside, and she went up past him with her heart striking hard against her stays, and he went down without a word, and both of them behaved for the rest of that day as though nothing at all had occurred, which was how they both knew that something had. I know some of you are sitting up now. Keep listening. It gets a great deal worse before it gets better, and it gets better in a way I promise you will feel in your chest. Because that same week, the peace of Reedmere ended, and it ended in the form of a carriage that came up the drive one bright cold morning, without warning or invitation, and set down at the great door a woman so beautiful that the footmen forgot themselves and stared. Cora saw her from the nursery window. She saw the pale gold hair and the travelling costume of a blue so deep it must have cost a governess's yearly wage, and she saw the way the woman stepped down and looked up at the great house as though she were coming home to a place that had been unaccountably kept from her, and Cora felt, without yet knowing a single thing about her, the particular cold that comes over you when a door you did not know was open blows suddenly shut. Her name was Lady Blanche Merivale, and 11 years before, she had stood up in front of the assembled best of London society, betrothed to the young Duke of Reedmere, and had let it be known, quietly, devastatingly, over the course of a single glittering season, that she had reconsidered and had left him to marry an older man with twice the fortune and a great house nearer to London, and had done it in the most public and humiliating manner that could be arranged, because a beautiful woman who wishes to trade up finds it useful to be seen doing so. Now, I want to stop the story here for a moment, because to understand what Lady Blanche did, you have to understand the machine she did it inside. Every spring, the great families of England came up to London for what was called the season, and beneath the balls and the concerts and the drives in the park, the season was a market, as frank in its way as any exchange in the city. Daughters were the goods. A young woman was brought out at 17 or 18, dressed at ruinous expense, and displayed for a handful of summers in which she was expected to secure a husband of rank and fortune, because a match was not a matter of the heart, but of land and money and the survival of a name. A great beauty was a great asset, and a great asset in a market goes to the highest bidder. Lady Blanche had been the beauty of her year, and she had done precisely what the market trained her to do. She had taken a better offer. She had simply done it more publicly and more cruelly than even that hard world thought quite good taste. That was the wound. That was the whole of it. A cold, hard duke in a cold, hard house had once been a young man who loved a beautiful woman, and she had made a spectacle of throwing him over, and he had never in 11 years allowed himself to be a fool in public again, which is why he had asked his grandmother to spare him the marriage market, and which is why, when a drab governess handed him back his ring in his own hall, some buried part of him had recognized, with a lurch, a courage he himself had lost long ago. And now the older husband with the great fortune was 3 months dead, and Lady Blanche Merivale was a widow, and she had come north. The Dowager Duchess received Lady Blanche in the great drawing-room, with a politeness so cold it could have frosted the windows, and Cora, summoned to bring Kitty down and present her, watched the whole performance from the doorway, and read it as easily as one of her French fables. "How wonderful," Lady Blanche was saying, her lovely voice pitched to Carrie, "to see dear Reedmere so little changed. And this must be the little ward one hears of. What a solemn little creature. Does she not speak? How very sad. And you." The blue eyes found Cora, and went over her once, the plain grey gown, the governess's cap, and dismissed her in the time it takes to blink. "You are the nursery governess, I collect. You may take the child up now. We shall not need you." It was so smoothly done, that dismissal, so practiced, that Cora felt the old familiar heat rise in her face, the heat of being made furniture in front of a room. But she had handed a duke his ring in this very house, and a beautiful widow held no terrors after that, and she inclined her head with perfect composure. "As her grace wishes," Cora said, and looked at the dowager, not at Lady Blanche, which was a small blade of its own, and the dowager's mouth twitched. "The child stays," the dowager said. "She likes the fire. Kitty, come and sit by your great-grandmother." And she held out her hand, and the little girl crossed the whole great drawing room past all those grand, cold people, and climbed up beside the fierce old woman, and put her small hand in the wrinkled one, and it was the plainest possible statement of where power truly lay in that house. And Lady Blanche Merivale, who had not become what she was without being able to read a room, understood it, and adjusted, and turned the full warmth of her attention upon the Duke. He had said almost nothing. He stood by the mantel with his face shut, and he watched the woman who had ruined him arrange herself on his grandmother's sofa and begin, gently, expertly, to remind him of what they had been to one another, and Cora, taking Kitty's slate up from the hearth so as to have a reason to remain a moment longer, watched him watch her, and could not read him at all, and hated, with a sudden violence that shocked her, that she could not. That night the Duke came to the nursery. He had never once come to the nursery. Cora was sitting alone by the fire after the child was asleep, mending a tear in a pinafore, because she could not bear to be idle, when the door opened without a knock, and he was standing in it, and she rose, and neither of them spoke for a moment. "You saw her," he said at last. "Not a question. Lady Merivale." "Yes, Your Grace. You know who she is. I know she was once betrothed to you, and married elsewhere, and is now a widow. The servants are not discreet, and I have ears. I know nothing beyond that, and it is none of my affair." He came into the room. He moved to the fire and stood looking down into it, and the light caught the hard planes of his face, and made them, for once, less hard, and Cora sat back down and took up her mending, because she sensed that he would speak more easily to a woman who was not staring at him, and she was right. "She left me," he said, in front of everyone. 11 years ago, I was 23, and I believed her when she said she loved me, and she let the whole of London watch her decide I was not worth the trouble after all, and she went off to marry Merivale and his 40,000 a year, and she made certain, before she went, that everyone knew precisely how little she had thought of what she was leaving. It is a small thing. Men survive worse, but I found afterward that I could not do it again. I could not stand in a room and offer myself up and let people watch to see whether I would be chosen or discarded. So I stopped. For 11 years I have simply stopped. He was quiet a moment, and then my grandmother sent me a governess in a wet gown, who handed me back my ring and walked into a storm rather than be appraised for one more minute, and I have not had a peaceful hour since. Cora's needle had gone still. She did not look up. "Why are you telling me this, Your Grace?" "I do not know," he said, and there was something almost like wonder in it. "I have not told it to a living soul in 11 years. I find I am telling it to you on a nursery floor at midnight, while you mend a child's pinafore. I could not tell you why if you held a pistol to my head. And now I want you to sit with the thing the Master of Reedmere had just done, because it is the beat this whole slow burn has been building toward." He had shown her the wound, not the cold that grew over it, the wound itself. He had let a woman he had insulted in his own hall see the exact place where he had been broken, and he had done it not to be pitied but because, for reasons he could not name, she was the first person in 11 years he had trusted to look at it and not use it against him. That is what obsession is, in these stories. It is not heat. It is the terrible relief of being seen by someone who will not turn the seeing into a weapon. "She has come back because Merivale is dead," Cora said, "and she wishes to be a duchess after all, now that she has counted the cost of not being one. You know this. You are not a stupid man. No, then you have only to send her away. It is not so simple." He turned from the fire and looked at her, and his face had shut again, but differently now, guarding something rather than hiding it. "She has kept certain letters I wrote to her when I was 23 and a fool. She reminded me of them this evening, very sweetly, over the tea. Letters that, if they were shown about, would make me a figure of the most exquisite ridicule from here to London. A man may be thought cold. A man may not be thought a sentimental boy who begged. She is not asking me for anything yet. She is only reminding me that she can. She was always very good at reminding people what she could do to them, long before she did it. He was being made a hostage in his own house by the woman who had already broken him once, and Cora, sitting by the fire with a child's pinafore in her lap, felt the whole shape of the trap close in her mind, and felt, too, rising underneath her careful composure, a heat on his behalf so fierce that it took her by surprise, because it had no business being there, because she was the governess, because he had called her a drab little thing in a turned gown, and none of that made the slightest difference to the fact that she wanted, quite suddenly and quite completely, to take Lady Blanche Merivale apart. "Then we had better find the letters," Cora said, "before she uses them." He looked at her for a long moment. "We," he repeated. "You are harboring my employer's grandson under a threat," Cora said, standing, folding the pinafore, meeting his eyes without a flinch. "And I find I do not like to see a wolf make free of a house that has, whatever its faults, given a friendless child a fire to sit by, and a mad old woman who loves her, and one governess who is not going anywhere. So yes, Your Grace, good night." And she left him standing in the nursery, and it was, though neither of them would have said so, the first time in 11 years that the Duke of Reedmere had not been alone with the thing that haunted him. They searched for the letters over the following fortnight, in the margins of the ordinary days, and it threw them together in ways that a great cold house had until then contrived to prevent. Lady Blanche had not brought the letters north with her. Cora was certain of that within a week, having watched the woman closely at every meal she was grudgingly permitted to attend, having noted that a woman who carried so dangerous a weapon on her person would touch, without thinking, the place she kept it, and Lady Blanche touched nothing. She had left them somewhere safe, in London, with a lawyer or a friend, and she had come north with only the memory of them and the smiling reminder, and that meant the threat could not be searched out of a drawer. It could only be answered. And answering it would require knowing a great deal more about Lady Blanche Merivale than she wished anyone to know, and so Cora, who had a gift for observation that 8 years of being invisible had honed to a fine edge, set herself to watch. It was during this fortnight that the almost happened. There had been a storm, one of the sudden violent storms that come down off the fells in spring, and the household had gone early to bed, and Cora had gone down to the library after midnight because she could not sleep, and because the library at Reedmere was the one room in that house she had come to love, a long, warm cave of books that the cold master had, she suspected, deliberately kept accessible to her, though he had never said so and she had never asked. She had found the Duke there before her. He was standing at the window watching the lightning walk along the tops of the fells, and he had a glass in his hand and no candle lit, and when she came in he did not turn, and she should have gone, and she did not go. "I could not sleep," she said, from the doorway. "Nor I." She came into the room. The fire had burned low, and the only light was the low red of it, and the white stammer of the lightning through the tall windows, and the rain came against the glass in long hissing sweeps, and Cora crossed to the window and stood beside him, not touching, and watched the storm walk the fells, and neither of them spoke for a long while, and it was the most companionable silence she had known in years. "I have been unjust to you," he said at last, low, still watching the storm. "From the first hour, you know that I have. You have. You do not spare me. You would not respect me if I did, and I find, Your Grace, to my own considerable surprise, that I should like you to respect me. I cannot at all account for it. You have given me no reason." He turned then. The lightning caught his face, and there was nothing cold in it now, nothing shut, and he looked at her the way she had wanted, without knowing she wanted it, to be looked at her whole life, as though she were not furniture, and not a governess, and not a woman past her best in a turned gown, but simply the only thing in the room worth looking at. "I have given you every reason to despise me," he said, "and instead you have made my house bearable for the first time in 11 years, and you have made a silent child hold up a slate, and you have stood between me and the thing I fear, And you have done all of it in a grey gown my grandmother bought you, asking nothing, and I have spent 2 weeks discovering that I cannot look at the door of a room without hoping you will come through it, and I do not know what to do with any of it, and I am not a man who does not know what to do." Cora's heart was going so hard she was certain he could hear it over the rain. "Your Grace?" "Cormac," he said. "For God's sake, just once. Say it once." And she looked up at him, and the storm walked the fells behind the glass, and the rain hissed against the window, and she opened her mouth to say his name, this man who had wounded her, and been wounded, this cold house made flesh, and he lowered his head toward hers, and his hand came up, and his fingers just touched the line of her jaw, warm, so warm, and she felt the whole of the distance between a duke and a governess narrow to nothing at all, to a breath, to less than a breath, and the library door opened, and a footman's voice said, "Your Grace, forgive me, there is a rider come from the village, the doctor is wanted, it is one of the tenants," and the world came back all at once, cold and loud and ordinary. Cora stepped back. The Duke stood very still, his hand falling to his side, and for a moment his face was murderous, and then it closed, and he said, "Yes, of course, I shall come." And he went, and Cora stood alone in the dark library with her hand pressed against her own jaw where his fingers had been, and understood that she had fallen, entirely and disastrously, in love with a man she had every reason in the world to leave. The doctor who came to Reedmere that night was a Mr. Elliot Prentice, a young physician who had lately taken the practice in the valley, who was known already to ride out to the hill farms and tend the people there, whether or not they could find a coin to pay him, and he was everything the Duke of Reedmere was not, open where the Duke was closed, warm where the Duke was cold, quick to smile and quicker to talk, and he took a great and immediate interest in the governess, who could discuss the fables of La Fontaine in the original and knew the Latin names of half the plants in the still-room garden. He began to find reasons to call. A tincture for the child, a book he thought Miss Finch might like, and Cora, who had been starved of ordinary kindness for so long that she had half forgotten what it tasted like, was warm to him, because he was warm to her, and because he treated her as an equal and a woman, and not as a piece of the furniture, and it cost her nothing, and it meant nothing, and it drove the Duke of Reedmere very nearly out of his mind. She saw it happen. She was not without vanity, and she was not without a certain hard-won understanding of men, and she saw the exact moment on a bright morning in the garden when the Duke came round the yew hedge and found his governess laughing at something the young doctor had said, her cap off, her face turned up to the sun, and she saw his whole body go still, and something in his eyes turn from ice to something a great deal more dangerous than ice. "Dr. Prentice," the Duke said, and his voice was perfectly pleasant, which Cora had learned was the most frightening thing his voice could be. "You are a long way from your patients." "Your Grace!" The young man rose, still smiling, not yet understanding what he was standing in front of. "I brought Miss Finch a book. Miss Finch has a great many books. My library is at her disposal. She has no need of yours." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "I am sure your tenants have need of your time, and I am sure you would not wish to give this household or Miss Finch any cause for talk, which a young unmarried woman in service can ill afford, as I am certain a man of your understanding is aware. Good morning, Doctor." It was a dismissal, and it was also a warning, and it was also, under the pleasant courtesy, so nakedly possessive that Cora felt her face go hot, and the young doctor, no fool after all, took his book, and his hat, and his leave, and the moment the yew hedge hid him, the Duke turned on Cora with his jaw set hard. "You will not encourage him?" "I was not aware," Cora said, standing, retrieving her cap, holding herself very straight, "that my mornings in the garden were subject to your Grace's approval. I am the child's governess. I am not your Grace's property. You made that distinction yourself, in your own hall, in front of your own servants, with a great deal of clarity. You may recall the occasion. It landed. She saw it land. And for a moment, she thought he would say something unforgivable, and instead he said something a great deal worse, because it was true. I know exactly what I said to you in that hall, he said, low and rough. I have not slept a full night since I said it. You are not my property, Miss Finch. You are the only person in England I cannot afford to lose, and I have no right to you at all, and watching that boy make you laugh in my own garden made me understand that I would burn this house to the ground before I let anyone take you out of it, and I know how that sounds, and I do not care, and now you know it too, and God help us both. And he turned and walked away across the wet grass, and left her standing among the yews with her cap in her hands, and her whole careful life coming apart at the seams. Now, I want to pause on the danger the Duke had just named, because a modern ear can miss how real it was. For a woman who earned her bread in another family's house, reputation was not vanity. It was capital, the only capital she had. A governess did not need to do anything improper to be ruined. She needed only to be talked about. A whisper that a young woman in service had drawn the eye of the master of the house, true or false, was enough to close every respectable door in England against her, because no family would take such a woman near their children. A man in the Duke's position could weather talk for a lifetime. Cora could not survive a week of it. When he warned the young doctor away from her, he was doing more than staking a claim. He was, in his graceless way, guarding the one thing she could not afford to lose. I told you it would get worse before it got better. We are nearly at the bottom now. Stay with me. What Cora did not know, standing in that garden, was that Lady Blanche Merivale had been watching the entire exchange from an upstairs window, and had understood every part of it, and had decided, in the cold, clever way she decided everything, that the drab little governess was no longer a matter of indifference but a rival, and that a rival, unlike an insult, had to be destroyed. Lady Blanche did not strike in the open. Women who have learned to win in drawing rooms rarely do. She came to Cora 3 evenings later, alone, in the nursery corridor, at the hour when the child was asleep and the house was quiet, and she was all warmth and sympathy, which was how Cora knew the knife was already out. I have been unkind to you, Lady Blanche said, and I have come to make amends, because I think, whatever our positions, we are both clever women, and clever women should understand one another. May I be frank? I know you love him. Oh, do not trouble to deny it, my dear. It is written all over you, and I do not blame you in the least. He is a very lovable ruin when one gets past the frost. But you are a governess, and he is a duke, and you know as well as I do that there is only one road that ends on for a woman in your position, and it is not the road to a coronet. It is the road to being talked about. And a governess who is talked about is a governess who never works again. Say what you have come to say, Lady Merivale. The blue eyes hardened, and the warmth fell away like a dropped shawl, and there she was underneath it, cold and clever and cornered, because Cora saw it now, saw it plainly, the look of a beautiful woman who has spent her last coin and staked everything on a single throw. I hold letters that will make him the laughing-stock of England, Lady Blanche said. You know this, and I have written a letter of my own, in a hand you will find remarkably like that of your last employer, describing exactly why Miss Cora Finch was turned out of a respectable house, without a character, theft, and a most unseemly attachment to the master of it. It is a very convincing letter. I have a gift for correspondence. If you are still under this roof in 3 days, that letter goes to every great house between here and London, and your name is finished, not merely at Reedmere, but everywhere, forever, and no reference from any dowager duchess in England will save it, because a whisper travels faster than a duchess's pen and lands harder. But, she smoothed her glove, if you go, quietly, of your own accord, tomorrow, and if he marries me as he ought always to have done, then the letters stay in their drawer, his dignity is preserved, your name is untouched, and you may take your excellent character and your excellent reference somewhere far away, and begin again. I am offering you your life, Miss Finch. All I ask in exchange is that you get out of mine." And she inclined her lovely head and turned, and left Cora standing alone in the dark corridor, with the whole trap sprung shut around her. Cora did not sleep that night. She sat by the nursery fire and she did the arithmetic, the old cold arithmetic of a woman with no ground under her feet, and every way she added it, it came out the same. If she stayed, she ruined the man she loved, made him a public fool a second time, and destroyed her own name in the bargain, and took from a silent child the one person who had reached her, because a governess in a scandal takes the scandal with her wherever she is sent. If she went, the man was safe, the child kept her reference and her honor, and only Cora herself was broken, and Cora had been broken before, and had learned that she could survive it, which is the cruelest lesson poverty teaches a woman, and the most useful. She chose the child. She chose the man. She wrote 2 letters of her own by the low firelight, one to the dowager, and one she did not sign and did not address, and at first light, before the house woke, she put on her own gown, the turned dark one she had arrived in, and took up the small case that held everything she owned, and she went to look, one last time, at the sleeping child. Kitty lay curled small in the great bed with the slate under her hand, and Cora stood over her for a long moment, and then she bent and kissed the child's hair, very lightly, and whispered, in French, because it was how they had begun, that she was sorry, and that she would carry her always, and that she must be brave and clever like the fox. And then she straightened, and she went out, and she did not let herself look back, because there is a kind of leaving that can only be done by not looking back, and Cora Finch had become, God knows, an expert in it. She went out through the kitchens while the house still slept, and out into the grey morning, and she set off down the long drive on foot, because she had not money enough for a hired trap, and too much pride to ask the dowager for it, meaning to walk the 7 miles to the village, and take the carrier's cart to the coach, and she did not know the fells, and she did not know how fast the weather turns on them in spring, and by the time she was 2 miles out on the high moor road, the mist had come down. It came down the way it comes down in that country, not gradually but all at once, a great soft blindness rolling off the tops, and within minutes Cora could not see the wall at the roadside, could not see her own feet, could not tell the road from the moor, and she did the thing that everyone who has ever been lost in mist does, which is to keep walking, and to walk wrong, off the road, out onto the open fell, into the wet and the white and the silence, and the ground turned soft and treacherous under her, bog and rushes and hidden stone, and somewhere she went down hard over an edge she never saw, and felt her ankle turn under her with a sickening wrench, and then she was on the cold ground in the mist, with a case beside her, and a leg that would not bear her, and no one in the world who knew where she was. She did not weep even then. She was too cold to weep. She dragged herself to the shelter of a broken wall, and got her back against the stone, and pulled her thin cloak around her, and made herself as small as she could against the wet and the rising wind, and she thought, with a strange far-off clarity, that this was very likely how it ended, out on a fell in the mist, a governess nobody would miss, and she found that the thing she minded most was not the dying. It was that she would never know whether he had read the unsigned letter, and whether he had understood. Back at Reedmere, the house woke to find the governess gone. The dowager read her letter, and went white, and rang every bell in her reach. But it was the child who broke the morning open, for when the household was told that Miss Finch had left in the night, that she had gone, that no one knew where, little Kitty, who had not spoken a word in 3 years, who had watched her whole small world be told it could not be relied upon to stay, stood up in the middle of the great hall in her nightgown in front of the assembled servants, and her great-grandmother, and the shut cold master she could not bear to look at, and she opened her mouth, and in a voice rusty and small and utterly clear, she said one word, Cora, and then, louder, the whole of 3 years' silence breaking at once. Cora, Cora, come back. Come back, come back, come back. The Duke of Reedmere was in the saddle before the child's second cry, bareheaded, without a coat, driving his horse down the drive into the mist, and the grooms who saw him go said afterward they had never seen a man ride like it, like something hunted, like something that had understood, 1 instant too late, exactly what it was about to lose. He found her by luck and by the horse's better sense, and by shouting her name into the white until his voice tore, found her at last against the broken wall 2 miles out, grey-lipped and half gone with cold, and he was off the horse and on his knees in the bog beside her, and he had her against his chest, inside his own arms, and he was saying her name over and over into her wet hair, not Miss Finch, her name, Cora, Cora, and Cora, surfacing up through the cold toward that voice, managed to get her eyes open, and managed, because she was who she was, 1 last piece of defiance. "You will," she said, through lips that would barely move, "ruin your coat." And the Duke of Reedmere, the coldest man in the north of England, put his face down against the top of her head and made a sound that was half a laugh and half something that had been locked up in him for 11 years, and he gathered her up out of the mud as though she weighed nothing, and he carried her home. They warmed her slowly, as one must, wrapped and watched by firelight, and the young Dr. Prentice came and bound the turned ankle and pronounced that she would keep the foot and the leg, and in time, the full use of both, and he did it all under the eye of a duke who did not once leave the room. And if Mr. Prentice had entertained any lingering hope in the matter of Miss Finch, 1 look at the Duke of Reedmere sitting sleepless by that bed put a quiet end to it. He was a sensible young man. He wished them both well, and he went home, and he is not important to the rest of this, except that he was kind when kindness was scarce, and I like to give the kind ones their due. It was 2 days before Cora was strong enough to be told the whole of it, and it was the dowager who told her, sitting by the bed with the child asleep against Cora's uninjured side, because Kitty would not be parted from her now, would not stop talking now, 3 years of words pouring out of her in a bright, unstoppable flood that no one in that house had the heart to check. "He knows what she threatened you with," the dowager said. "He found your letter, the one you did not sign. He read it a great many times, and then he came to me, and for the first time in 11 years, my grandson asked me for help instead of refusing it, and we have spent 2 days, he and I, and a very discreet man of business, learning the exact position of Lady Blanche Merivale. Would you like to know it?" The old eyes glittered. "She is ruined. Merivale left nothing but debts and a mortgaged house, and a great many creditors who have been remarkably patient with a beautiful widow, and are patient no longer. She came north because she had precisely 1 thing left to sell, which was the memory of a young duke who once loved her, and 1 weapon left to sell it with, which was a packet of foolish old letters and a talent for forgery. She staked everything on this house, and she has lost, my dear, though she does not yet know it, and my grandson has asked that you be well enough to see it, because he says, and I find I agree with him, that the woman who was humiliated in that hall has the first right to watch the account settled." The account was settled on a Thursday, in the great drawing-room, before a carefully assembled company. For the Duke of Reedmere had done a thing no one expected. He had let it be known through the county that he meant to make an announcement regarding his future, and Lady Blanche Merivale, hearing it, believing she had won, believing the governess gone and the field hers, had dressed herself in her finest and taken her place near the mantel with the serene confidence of a woman about to be made a duchess at last. The neighbouring families had come, the vicar had come, and the dowager had seen to it, quietly, that certain other people had come too, a magistrate, a solicitor from London, and a grey old clerk who had served the house of Merivale for 30 years and knew the hand of every soul in it. Cora was brought down last, on the Duke's arm, walking slowly, leaning on him, into the room where 2 months before She had been called a drab little thing in a turned gown, and she felt the whole company turn and stare, and she held her chin level, because she had learned how, and she watched Lady Blanche Merivale's lovely face change, in the space of a breath, from the ease of a woman certain she had won, to a stillness, to the moment the colour went out of it altogether. "You are all very good to have come," the Duke said, and the room quieted, and he did not let go of Cora's arm. "I promised you an announcement concerning my future, and you shall have it, but first I find I must clear away a small matter concerning my past, because I have discovered that I cannot build anything worth having on a foundation I am still afraid of." He turned, unhurried, to the woman at the mantel. "Lady Merivale, you have these 2 months reminded me most sweetly and most often of certain letters I wrote to you when I was 23. Letters that would, you assured me, make me a figure of ridicule from here to London were they ever read aloud." The room had gone very still. "Read them," the Duke said. "I have thought about it a great deal, and I find I no longer care. Read every word. Let them laugh. I was a boy who loved without protecting himself, and I have spent 11 years being ashamed of it, and I have decided, this week, that there are a great many worse things to have been than a boy who loved. You have held that shame over me like a knife. I am setting it down. It has no edge that can cut me any longer, because I no longer mind the wound. Do you understand me? Your knife is a feather. You have nothing." Lady Blanche's face had gone the colour of ash. "But you," the Duke went on, and his voice, which had been almost gentle, changed, and the room felt it change. "You were not content to threaten me. You wrote a letter, in another woman's hand, accusing an innocent woman in my employ of theft and of dishonour, meaning to drive her onto the road and ruin her name in every house in England, so that no one would ever again give her the reference on which her whole livelihood depends. You wrote it. You told her of it yourself, believing she had no witness and no recourse. She wrote down every word you said that same night, and signed it and dated it, and gave it into my grandmother's keeping." He held up a single sheet. "And here is the letter you forged, the one you handed to a messenger to carry south. You ought to have known better. A man who is paid 5 shillings by a widow will think a very long while about what a duke might offer him instead, and my own man reached him before he had so much as cleared the valley, and bought both the letter and the whole account of who had paid for it. 2 documents, my lady, yours and hers. I have a magistrate in the room, and a solicitor, and Mr. Hartley there, who served your late husband's family 30 years, and will tell this company, on his oath, whose hand truly wrote this forgery." The old clerk stepped forward and put on his spectacles and studied the forged letter for a long moment, in a silence so complete you could hear the fire, and then he looked up and said, in the flat voice of a man who has spent his life among documents and cares more for the truth of a hand than for the rank of the person who wrote it, "That is her ladyship's writing, your grace, disguised. I should know it anywhere. There is not a doubt of it in the world." And that was the end of Lady Blanche Merivale. Now, I want you to understand precisely how complete a ruin that was, because a modern ear may not hear it. Forgery, in 1854, was not a social misstep. It was a crime, and a grave one, once a hanging crime, and still, in that year, one that could send a person of any rank to prison or to transportation across the sea. And beyond the law, there was the thing that governed everything in that world, which was reputation. A beautiful widow with debts might yet have married her way back to safety, for beauty and a great name will forgive a great deal. But a proven forger, a blackmailer exposed before a magistrate and the assembled gentry of a county, was finished in every way that world could finish a woman. No house would receive her. No man of standing would have her. The doors did not slam. They simply, quietly, all across England, ceased to open. She had come north with one last coin to spend, and she had spent it, and she left Reedmere that same afternoon in the same carriage that had brought her, and she does not come into this story again, because that world had no further use for her, and neither, I confess, have I." And then the Duke of Reedmere turned to the woman on his arm, in front of the whole assembled company, in the very room, before the very people, and he did the thing that mattered. "2 months ago," he said, and his voice was not steady now, and he did not try to make it steady, "in the hall of this house, in front of my own servants, I looked at this woman, who had come 300 miles on my grandmother's word, and I told her that she was not what I ordered. I have never in my life been so wrong about anything, or so ashamed of anything, and I have wanted, every day since, to say so where the same people could hear it who heard the insult, because an insult given in public is a debt that can only be paid in public." He faced her fully. He took both her hands. "Cora Finch, you handed me back my ring and walked into a storm rather than let me make you small, and you woke a silent child, and you stood between me and my own fear, and you would have thrown your whole life away in the mist to protect a man who had given you nothing but cruelty and a cold house. I am not offering you security. My grandmother has already given you that, in your own name, and it is yours whatever you say to me. So understand that you are free, entirely free, to refuse me and walk out of that door again this minute with your head high and your future safe. I am not offering you a bargain. I am asking you, as a man asks the one person he cannot live without, whether you could bear to spend your life with the fool who did not know you when you stood in front of him. Marry me, not because you must, only if you wish it. There is no arrangement in this. There is only me asking." The room did not breathe, and Cora Finch, who had walked out of this house once with nothing, looked up at the man who had learned, at such cost, how to ask instead of order, and she felt the whole long, cold winter of her life turn over at last towards something like spring, and she was aware of every eye in the room, and she found she did not care about a single one of them, because for the first time since she was a girl, there was only one person in any room who mattered, and he was holding both her hands and waiting, without command, without certainty, for her to choose. "You understand," Cora said, and her voice carried, level and clear, the governess's voice, the voice that had never once flinched in a room where her feelings were unwelcome, "that I am impertinent and stubborn and a great deal too clever for my own good, and past my best, and that I shall contradict you at every table for the rest of your life." "I am counting on it," the Duke said, "and that the child comes first, always. She is mine now, whatever else." "She was yours," he said, "from the moment she held up a fox." "Then yes," said Cora. "Cormac, yes." And a small voice from the doorway, where a 7-year-old girl had been standing in her best frock, watching the whole of it with enormous solemn eyes, said, clear as a bell into the silence, "Does that mean she is staying?" And the whole grand company, magistrate and vicar and gentry and all, dissolved at once into the kind of laughter that has tears underneath it, and the Dowager Duchess of Reedmere sat very upright in her chair by the fire and wept without shame or apology. An old woman who had gambled everything on a stranger in a wet cloak, and won more than she had dared to hope, and the Duke of Reedmere drew the governess he had once called worthless into his arms in front of everyone who had heard him say it, and this time no bell rang, and no footman came, and nothing in the world interrupted them at all. They were married before midsummer, quietly, in the small church in the valley, with Kitty scattering flowers and talking the entire way up the aisle, because she had 3 years of words to spend, and meant to spend every one of them. Now, I promised you history woven through, and here at the end is the last of it, because it matters to what Cora chose. When a woman married in 1854, the law did a strange and total thing to her. Under the doctrine of coverture, her legal person was folded into her husband's. She could not, in most cases, own property in her own right, or keep her own earnings, or sign a contract, or claim her own children in a dispute. In marrying, a woman of that age placed her entire self into another person's hands and trusted, with no protection but his character, that those hands would be kind. It would be 28 years before Parliament passed the Married Women's Property Act and gave a wife back the right to be, in the eyes of the law, a person. So understand what Cora Finch did going up that aisle. She had just been given, by the dowager's hand, the one thing she had wanted her whole adult life, which was security that belonged to her and to no one else. A reference and a wage in her own name, the ground under her own 2 feet at last. And she chose, freely, with that security already hers and safe, to give herself into the keeping of a man anyway. That is not weakness. A woman with nothing who marries for safety is doing what she must. A woman with safety already in her hand who marries for love is doing something else entirely. She is choosing. It is the rarest thing that world allowed a woman, and Cora, who had spent her life with no choices at all, spent the first real one she was ever given on him. I have to stop here one last time, because this is the part that gets me every time I tell one of these. It is not the coronet, it is not the great house, or the ruin of the villain, or even the man on his knees, though I know that is what draws you in, and I am glad it does. It is the child in the doorway asking whether she is staying. It is a small, forgotten creature who had decided the world could not be relied upon to stay, learning, at 7 years old, that sometimes it can, that sometimes the person who kneels down on the nursery floor and reads to the fire, in a language you do not understand, is telling you the truest thing of all, which is that you are worth staying for. That is why I make these. I think a great many of us were that child once, in one house or another, and I think a part of us is still standing in the doorway, all these years later, waiting to hear that someone is staying. Cora Finch became the Duchess of Reedmere, and she contradicted her husband at every table for the rest of a long life, exactly as promised, and the coldest house in the north of England was cold no longer, and the woman who had once been told she was not what he ordered turned out to be the only thing he had ever truly needed, and he never for one day of the rest of his life forgot it. And that is how it ended, or rather, that is how it began. So tell me, what would you have done, standing in that hall, with nowhere on earth to go, when the most powerful man in the county looked at you and said you were not what he ordered? Would you have wept and stayed and made yourself small enough to be tolerated, or would you have handed back the ring and walked into the rain, the way Cora did, with nothing but your own straight spine to keep you warm? And here is the harder one. When he came back, changed, on his knees, would you have been able to forgive him? I am genuinely asking. Tell me below, because I read every single comment, and I think the answers to that question say a great deal about the lives the people asking them have lived. If this story moved you, leave me a comment and tell me the moment that undid you. For me, it will always be a small girl in a doorway asking if she is staying. And if you found your way here tonight and you are not yet part of this little community, come and join us. Subscribe, so you are here when the next one drops. And it is a good one, I promise you. Darker than this, and with a reckoning, I have been saving for months. Until then, wherever in the world you are, whatever the hour, thank you for spending it with me. Take care of yourselves, and remember that the people who cannot see your worth are only telling you where they end, not where you do. I will see you in the next one.